Hello again, welcome back everyone. LiquorHound here with you. Thank you for joining me for another Spirit Review video. Today we're going to be sitting down and discussing Garrison Brothers Texas Straight Bourbons. Garrison Brothers, they do a vintage release every year. They actually do 2 times a year they do their releases. One in the spring, one in the fall. So depending on which bottle you get, you might get a different version of the other. So what we're going to find out here today is there really any difference between the actual vintages? What we have is the fall of 2012, bottled at 94 proof, and we have the spring of 13, again 94 proof. I have to thank my friend Steve down in Fredericksburg for sending me this spring of 13 bottle. It's brand new, it hasn't even made it up to where I'm at yet, but he wanted me to review it, and I thought this would be a great way to give a little bit of, see if there's any contrast between the two bottlings, especially since they're back to back. Okay. Then at the end we're actually going to go and review the very rare Cowboy Bourbon by the Garrison Brothers. This is a 375 milliliter bottle that they do, and it is quite the reserve, let's say it that way, of their best barrels, and we'll talk a little more about that one shortly. But before we get there, I have to discuss the things that makes Garrison Brothers pretty special. First and foremost, it's made here in Texas, down in High, Texas, which is just outside of Fredericksburg, and down there, they're aging their barrels in a barn down there. So it's not in a big rick house like you would get in Kentucky, okay? It's just a barn. The other thing that makes them very unique in the bourbon world is they're using a 4-grain recipe. They're using corn, soft red winter wheat, rye, and barley in the mash bill. All the other bourbons that you see on your store shelves are going to be a 3-grain. It's going to be, usually it's going to be corn, barley, and either rye or wheat. They don't ever do 4-grain. The 4-grain has been done once before back in 2006 when Woodford Reserve Master Select released the 4-grain. Other than that, Tuttletown Spirits there in New York has one currently that is known as Hudson's 4-grain. It is available. Again, it's a small bottle usually, but that's the only 4-grain I know of. But to make this one even a little more special, they actually use a sweet mash. It's another very unique thing in the bourbon world. Sweet mash, what that simply means is once they ground the grains, they put it in the tank and they're cooking it up, and once it's left to ferment and it's ready after about 5 days of fermentation in the Garrison Brothers situation, they go to distill all of it. They distill all that beer. To whereas all the other bourbons on the shelf that you see, regardless if they say sour mash or not, they are sour mash bourbons. All that simply means is they hold back a little bit of that soured mash, and as the new batch comes in, they put that in with there. And what it kind of does is it kind of kickstarts the fermentation. It also bumps up the flavor of that bourbon. And it's kind of like sourdough. They just keep it going, keep it going. There's nothing wrong with it. It creates great bourbons. But if you want to try sweet mash, this is your chance. If you want to try 4-grain, this is your chance. Unfortunately, Garrison Brothers is rather limited in distribution right now. It's all throughout Texas. But beyond that, probably, I think Chicago got 11 cases of it, and I'm hoping New York and LA at least have some. So check the big online retailers, and you can probably get your hands on one if you decide to there. Now, I was reading on some message boards, bourbon message boards, and people are pretty upset with Garrison Brothers in that the price point. The standard vintage bottling runs around $70, $75, and they're upset about the age, 2 years old. But like I said, before you run for the pitchforks and torches and run down to Hyde, Texas, make sure you take in consideration the uniqueness of this spirit. As far as the 2-year maturation, I'm not that upset with it because Texas is very, very hot in the summer. I don't think, well, I know you couldn't get 20-year-old Texas bourbon, not in an uncooled warehouse. I mean, these things laying up in a barn might be able to survive 6, maybe 8 years, but I'm thinking more like 6, before the barrel just empties out. It's just way too hot. This week here in Texas, it was already 100 degrees. In Kentucky, it's still 81 to 84 this week. So as you can see, big, big differences. The other difference is Kentucky has big warehouses, 9 stories tall. You're able to put barrels in the center of that warehouse at the bottom where it stays pretty cool. That's how come you're able to get 20 plus years maturation in Kentucky bourbons. Not so much in Texas. So, again, 2-year-old, and now let's talk about Cowboy Bourbon. Cowboy Bourbon, after going through about 500 barrels creating this one, they found 10 that were superior above all the rest. They took those 10 and they thought, you know what, let's give it as much maturation as we can, and they let it sit around another year and a half or so. So this one's about 3, almost 4-year old. By the time that came around, there wasn't much left in the barrels. They tasted it, they loved it, and so they were able to bottle 600 of these small bottles. Again, price point on this one, $160. It's very, very steep, but you know, it all depends. Is it worth it to you to try something that not only is very unique in the bourbon world, but is the rarest or the most special of that bourbon? Anyway, it's your decision. So let's go ahead and get to the actual nosing. Fall of 2012. You have to be careful when you're getting in these glasses. I get apricot and peaches, and there's also a fair amount of caramel right up front. A big brown sugar nose and cinnamon as well. It almost reminds me of a really nice cobbler type thing. You can get a little bit of that oak and also a little bit of like the yeast coming through. So think fresh baked yeast rolls. That's kind of what it reminds me of. All right, let's see if the Spring of 13 has a little bit of uniqueness. It's similar. The one thing I did find in this one was it had a very sweet corn aromatic to it. This one also has a sweet corn feel right up front, but there's a difference in that it also smells a little bit of a little more raw than this one did. It smells a little more like fresh ground corn. Decent amount of vanilla and caramel. It's almost butterscotch. There's also cedar, a little cigar box in that background. Cinnamon's still there. And kind of like a sweet candied date is what I'm picturing in my mind. Almost a plum, but I just lean a little more towards a sweet candied date. Alright, Cowboy. Other thing to know about Cowboy real quick, Uncut, Unfiltered, 136 proof. So I'm going up from 94 to 136. Alcohol is a little bit warmer on the nose, but the flavors are so much more bold in this one. It's very, very sweet smelling, a lot of caramel. Where I was getting more butterscotch in these, in this one I feel it gets a little deeper, a little richer, so I feel more like a caramel aroma. There is that big fresh corn, sweet corn in there. But there's also a nice apricot and orange peel going on. It kind of reminds me of Grand Marnier. And it gets a little like cocoa in the middle, almost like a Mexican chocolate with that cinnamon in there. It has that sweet, but it's also a little bittersweet. And the big cinnamon with the chocolate just reminds me of Mexican hot chocolate. Alright, let's go ahead and get to the tasting. Fall of 2012. I did add a couple drops to each of these of water before I started. Help them open up just real quick. Medium viscosity. It doesn't feel silky or oily, but it doesn't feel thin. It's right in the middle. Medium warmth. There's also that fresh corn coming through. It's fairly sweet for a bourbon, but there's also a big oak and cinnamon in the middle. And it's kind of drying, maybe a little black tea right there mid-palate. That's what it feels like when it's drying. And on that finish, maybe a hint of plum, tobacco leaf, like a, yeah, it's mostly tobacco leaf, and a little leather. The tannins are still lingering, that bitter tea, that dryness on the tongue is still lingering in the background on that finish. So overall, it starts out, it feels sweet right up front and pretty bold, and then it transitions and gets a more like a tobacco and a little bit of the black tea element, the tannins, a little more of that oak kicking in on that finish. So it is different, but it is just transitioning, and that's something very unique to a very young bourbon. Most of the time you don't see transitioning bourbons until they get at least 10, 15 years old. Alright, Spring of 13. Like the nose, it definitely feels softer on the palate than this one. I would still call it a medium viscosity. But right after it goes down, it feels a little sweet, fresh corn. A little bit of butterscotch. Again with the drying on the mid palate. Black tea, oak right there on the mid palate. On the finish, I'm getting a little bit of cedar, a little bit of that loose leaf tobacco, and cigar box. As far as fruits on this one, whereas I was getting the candied dates on the nose, on the actual finish, there is a very light plum, and you could call it a date type feel right there on that finish. Alright. Cowboy. Let's see. Wow. That's a big glass of bourbon. Wow. Huge flavor. It is a little warm, you know, 136 proof with a few drops of water isn't going to make too much of a difference. But it does feel so silky, sweet caramel, where I was getting almost a hint of butterscotch in this one. By the time it is aged further and gotten deeper in flavor, it feels more like caramel. But that nice fresh corn with the sweetness is very nice. And it does have a little bit of a apricot, a little bit of cinnamon, not as bold as maybe some of these others with the cinnamon kick, but it's definitely in there. And on the finish, I'm starting to get a little bit of that chocolate and nice lingering with that cinnamon. So it's like a bittersweet chocolate. Apricots right up there in the front. And then right there on the finish. Yeah, then we're getting into like the cedar, sweet loose leaf tobacco. That sweetness is just lasting throughout. And overall, it is very still warm. You know, that's the one thing. But overall, I think they're really nice. The one thing I think that's very unique is that fresh corn flavor that's in each and every one of them. That's something you don't always find in other bourbons, simply because once they get that age on them, they kind of almost forget where they came from. And these definitely let you know that this is coming from a corn, almost a moonshine type aspect, a white dog. You can still get that little bit of that fresh grain flavor coming through. So it's overall very nice. I think the 2012 is pretty bold. I think that one could stand up to a little bit of water and actually come out really nice with the flavors. The Spring of 13 here, a little bit of water maybe. You're just going to have to deal with that warmth. I think if you add too much water, you're going to lose a little too much flavor on it. The Cowboy definitely could use a little water, but again, it's so big and bold, it's going to make it. So whatever you choose to do, hope you enjoyed this video. Everybody have a great evening, and cheers.